Hey friends, and welcome back to Silverhawk Farm. We are back in my kitchen, and today we are talking about cast iron. If anyone is new here, my name is Bree, and I love to do all sorts of homestead things like growing food, raising chickens, raising goats, raising free-range children, all the good stuff. So I had actually been planning on doing a cast iron video eventually, but now is the perfect time because a dear friend of mine just got her very first apartment of her own, and as a housewarming gift, I decided to get her her first cast iron. And I know that cast iron can sometimes be kind of like an intimidating thing, so I figured that I would go over kind of my system from collecting cast iron over the years and maintaining at least this one pan for a very long time. So I figured I would just make a video to go over what I do when I first get a pan, how I maintain it after I've bought it, how I cook with it, and what sort of rules I have, what equipment or tools that I use when I use it. The thing about cast iron is that it should be simple, and it can last for a very long time if taken care of, and even if neglected, you can usually restore them. If it's your very first time working with cast iron and you're interested in getting a cast iron pan, you can of course try and find some secondhand. If you do that, the things you're going to want to look for are whether it's warped, meaning that if you set it on a flat surface and try and spin it, does it spin? Because that's not good. It should just kind of scoop like a flat surface. And whether it's cracked. If it's cracked, you won't be able to cook with it. In the olden days, they would use cast iron for lead-based things, and that can leach into the cast iron and into your food. So if you're working with very old stuff, get a lead kit and just be sure. But personally, I am a huge fan of just getting a new cast iron because I've found that the prices are pretty similar. For example, this 10-inch Lodge, I think ran me about $20-25, and I paid a similar amount for this one. I think that the Lodge is a really good company to start with. They're really affordable, really accessible. They're made in the USA. But the one thing that Lodge kind of has as a disadvantage is that it comes pre-seasoned, but the pre-seasoning is a little bit rough. So I thought one thing we could look at is the difference between these two. This pan is my pan that I've been cooking with and seasoning and have seasoned on my own several times. I've been cooking, I'm not sure exactly when I picked this up, but I've definitely been cooking with it for several years. And then this is the pan that I just picked up for my friend. You can see it's a little bit more matte if I show it in the light. This one's got a shine to it because there's layers of seasoning built up over it. And then the consistency on this is a little bit more like a fine sandpaper. So it does come pre-seasoned, and you can totally cook with this right away. However, it's gonna be a little bit rough. So if you decide to stick with the pre-seasoning and start cooking right away, that's totally valid. You can skip all of the oven stuff I'm about to do and just start making bacon. I would recommend starting with things that are very fatty and that are less likely to stick. Whereas something like this one that I've been maintaining, this is my oldest cast iron, it's extremely smooth on the bottom. So I can fry eggs in here without getting it stuck to the bottom of the pan really easily. Whereas if I were to start with this one, I think it would probably stick the first several times unless I were using like an inordinate amount of butter or other fat. So my other pans that I have here are actually a set of 3 pans that my husband picked up for me from Menards. They just saw that there were some cast iron pans and knew that I was really into cast iron and they were a good deal. So they picked those up and brought them as a gift for me. And they're a little bit thinner. They're definitely a little bit cheaper than the Lodge, but them being thinner actually makes them less heavy compared to something that's a similar size. For example, this is a 10-inch and this is a 10-inch, and when I'm having issues with my arthritis, this is the pan that I reach for. Similarly, this is actually not cast iron, this is carbon steel, and that is another alternative if cast iron is just too heavy for you. Definitely look into getting some carbon steel. The disadvantage to the thinner pans is that they don't hold heat as well, which is one of the things that you really want cast iron for. So whereas this is going to hold a lot of heat even if I put something very cold on top of it, for example, if I'm using this to make steak and I have it blasting hot, I can throw on some very cold steaks and it's going to immediately very nicely sear that steak. Whereas something that's a little bit thinner, it's gonna cool down quite a bit more when you hit it with something cold. And so that's just something to keep in mind if that really matters to you. If the thing you're trying to get is the perfect steak and you are able to lift the heavier pan, I would definitely go for that. So my biggest advice to new cast iron owners, beyond just cooking it, use fatty foods at first until you feel comfortable. is to clean it really well and then re-season it after you've cleaned it. My system is that after I am done cooking, I let it cool to the point that I can handle it, and then I wash it out with soap and water. It's actually a misconception that you can't use soap with cast iron. That used to be true when soap was made with lye. Now that soaps are made with different chemicals and entirely different things, and actually store-bought soaps such as like a Dawn dish soap or Seventh Generation or any of the ones that you're used to using are actually a really good way to make sure that you're getting up any excess oils or food particles that actually aren't part of your seasoning. They're actually impeding your seasoning from developing. Basically, seasoning is just oil or Crisco or any sort of fat that builds up on your pan over time. It actually bonds to the cast iron itself and becomes part of it. That's why you should be able to wash it really well, scrub it really well, and not lose any of the seasoning if it's a really well seasoned pan. That's also what makes it non-stick. So this pan that I have had for, I literally don't even know how many years, but I'm gonna hazard a guess at 10. This has a really smooth bottom, and I can actually just fry eggs pretty much directly on it without needing to use much oil, without having the eggs stick. When I'm building my seasoning, my preferred oil to use really just depends on whatever neutral oil I'm using at the time. Generally, I actually use sunflower oil because I live somewhere where sunflower oil is really easy to source locally. There are a lot of sunflowers in Kansas, but I ran out of my local sunflower oil, so right now I'm using safflower oil. I think that basically anything that has a high smoke point will work well, so you don't want to use olive oil. Not only is it not a neutral taste, but it actually has a really low smoke point, so it's not going to bind as easily. And then I wouldn't recommend flaxseed oil. I know that some people have done it with a lot of success, but personally, I've had problems with my seasoning flaking off of the pan, and there's nothing more frustrating than going through the entire process of seasoning only to have it flake off and make your pan really uneven. So I would stick to Crisco, olive oil, just like the generic cheap olive oil that you would use for frying, safflower oil, sunflower oil, any of those really high smoke point oils with the exception of flaxseed will do just fine. A lot of people use clarified butter or ghee. A lot of people use bacon. For me, when I've used bacon before, I've had a pan go kind of rancid. So do that at your own risk, but if it's something that you use super frequently and that you're keeping clean and you have a system for it, I've heard of a lot of people using bacon with a lot of success. If we're talking about cleaning, the vast majority of the time I just use a regular old dish scrubber. I, for the most part, don't have a lot of like particles and stuff built up because I have a lot of good seasoning on my pans, so usually there's not much that sticks. I will use a paper towel to remove any excess oils before I wash it because I don't want that going down my drain and messing up my whole septic system. We don't need that. Occasionally stuff will bind to the pan so much so that you need some help. So I have one of these. This is actually a Lodge brand, and I think it came with my pan, and you can just use that to scrape up any extra excess food particles. I also have this chainmail scrubber, which is meant for cast iron, and you would think that that would scratch it up really bad, but it doesn't. It does great. I would recommend, if you go with any sort of a chainmail scrubber type of thing, using it with water. I was surprised that just it on dry cast iron didn't do much for getting it cleaned off. When it comes to tools I can use, the lovely thing about cast iron is that you can use whatever you have. So if you have plastic that is totally safe to use on it, I tend to cook at such a high heat that I melt plastic, so I really enjoy cast iron for being able to work really well with metal and wooden spatulas. My biggest recommendation is actually to use a metal spatula because the straight edge, the scraping along it, over time will actually help to even out your seasoning and will create a really beautiful smooth surface. As soon as I started using a metal spatula almost exclusively, my seasoning at the bottom of this pan in particular, which is like my egg pan, just improved so much. It's so smooth compared to like a new pan or even one that's been seasoned quite a few times. I love to use wood as well for utensils. So my other favorite one is this one with the flat, and you can do a lot of scraping along the things, and that works great, especially if you don't have a metal spatula. Like, cast iron is not something you need to go out and get a bunch of new equipment for at all. But to help my friend have a little bit more success with her cast iron, I decided to go ahead and do some seasoning rounds inside the oven, which will allow me to build up a couple of rounds of seasoning that would take more time to do if we were to just do it by cooking. So I've actually done this quite a few different ways, and I'm actually trying a new system today. So I'll Be sure to report on how it works out. I'll know by the end of the video how it's looking. This process is supposed to be a little bit easier for people that are new to cast iron because it's a tendency when seasoning to use too much oil and not get enough of the oil off, which can create stickiness and kind of like these oily, weird streaks on your cast iron. If you do get that, it's absolutely not the end of the world. You can just keep cooking or use a little bit of oil to even it out and wash it off really well and try another round of seasoning. But for the most part, I've just kept cooking with them and it's been just fine. I did get this process from a Reddit user in the cast iron subreddit. The cast iron subreddit on Reddit is a really great resource for finding different ways to clean, restore, identify cast iron. So if you're trying to get really into the nitty-gritty of stuff, I would head over there. I will note that it's Reddit, so sometimes people can be unnecessarily volatile, especially when you're talking about a metal pan. And I'll be sure to link the whole process below from the original post that this person posted so that you can follow along and season your own cast iron pans if you'd like to. The first step of this process involves preheating the oven to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Hey friends, Future Bree popping in to say, don't believe what she just said. We actually want to preheat it to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, I misread the recipe and we're just going with it. So 300 degrees, not 200. See you in a bit. So I have my stove preheated to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and I actually have a double stove back here. It's one of the things I love most about this house and is one of the reasons I was so sold on buying it. But I don't use the second stove all that often. Truth be told, the second stove on bottom is where my cast iron usually lives. So today I've actually preheated both ovens so that I can ideally get most, if not all of these seasoned at one time. I'm gonna see what I can fit, but if I can't fit all of them, this one's so well seasoned, I'm just gonna skip it and keep cooking with it. While the oven's preheating, I can go ahead and get the oil into the pans. So I personally prefer to season with oils, mostly just because I have it around because I cook with a lot of oils. So I'm using safflower oil today, and I actually have this spray bottle that's refillable that my mother-in-law got me, thank you Sharon. And it has a little funnel so I can have a very small amount of oil come out, which is really what you want when you're trying to season cast iron. So I've moved that one out of the way, and I'm going to basically take my pan, do one little spritz, and then wipe it as much as possible and see how that looks. I do use paper towels when it comes to seasoning cast iron because I have concerns about getting oil of any sort into my water lines because that can be really bad for water lines. So there aren't a lot of things in my house that I use paper towels for. Honestly, just two things: cast iron and icky animal stuff. So I'm wiping it down really well, and then I'm spreading it all around. And it feels like it's not doing anything, but we actually want it to be quite dry when you get it into the oven. You want a very, very, very thin coating of oil because that's what's actually creating the seasoning. And when I'm doing this in the oven, I'm always sure to get the handles and the edges and things because those will also build up just like a really beautiful sheen, and it'll help protect it from rust. When I'm seasoning it between cooks, I usually just do the inside of the pan. So now that I've got a very, very small amount of oil spread really thin across this whole pan, I'm going to put it upside down in the oven for 20 minutes, and then we'll bring it out before bringing the temperature up. This is going to be another step that hopefully will make this foolproof, and we'll be able to avoid having too much oil on the pan so that it streaks and becomes sticky. So once I get all of the rest of these nice and oiled up, I'm gonna put them in the oven for 20 minutes, and then we'll do another layer of wiping out the oil before we return it to the oven at a higher temperature. So as you saw, I misread the recipe and I actually needed to preheat the oven to 300 degrees. Once I noticed that, I cranked the oven up to 300 degrees with all the pans still in there, and it's been there for a little over 20 minutes. We're gonna pull it out, let it cool down a little bit, and then wipe it down really, really well so that the oils and everything coat the pan, but also don't gather so much that they become sticky and that they don't actually adhere to the cast iron itself. And then after that, we're going to put it back in the oven at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour, and then we'll pull it out if we want to right away, or we can leave it to cool in the oven. Good morning, friends. It's actually the next day. I've got my coffee, and I just pulled these out of the oven. I did go ahead and just let them rest in the oven overnight while they were cooling off. I also could have done another round of seasoning after waiting for them to cool a bit and continue to season until I get that perfect non-stick surface. For me, I just wanted to add like a little bit of seasoning without making it a whole labor-intensive thing. A couple of things to note that I forgot to mention is that it can get very smoky when you're seasoning your cast iron. So while I was running it, I was mostly staying out of the kitchen. I had my vent fan on above the stove there. I cracked the window, and I also had all of the fans going in the house. It's definitely a little bit of a smell and a little bit of a process, but it's nice to have done. And honestly, for a Lodge cast iron, you could totally skip that. And even if you do it just the once, it's gonna help a ton with building your seasoning and making it just a little bit more non-stick and a little bit more safe from rust. So I could go ahead and store these right away, but I'm actually going to do another small layer of oil on all of these just to make sure that there isn't any exposed iron or anything like that that could lead to rust while it's being stored. I have heard of things like the oil going rancid when people do that, and that's mostly for people who don't use their cast iron a whole lot. So if you don't use your cast iron very often, I would just either add a very small layer of oil or just get in the habit of oiling it before you cook. And another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was cooking with this stuff, because that's the whole purpose. I mentioned before that bacon is a good start. Anything that's really fatty is probably a good option for you as far as getting your seasoning built. Also, shallow frying, like frying in these things, will really help to add the seasoning, because that's just getting it completely immersed in oil and then nice and hot. Obviously, like, you'll clear out the oil after you fry with it, but there will be like a layer of oil that stays on as seasoning and becomes lovely seasoning if you do a lot of shallow frying, or deep frying if you're working in a bigger cast iron pot. So there are a lot of meaty ways to season your cast iron, but if you don't eat meat, one great way to season cast iron is by cooking some diced onions or sliced onions, however you like them, with some oil over a good long time. I'm not really sure the science of why onions work really well for seasoning cast iron, but they do. And then as far as my favorite things to cook in them, I do cook most things that I cook in general in my cast iron, but I think that it's particularly good for things like steak, things that you're gonna shallow fry. I really like a deep dish pizza in this. Like a pan pizza is literally made for cast iron. They're perfect in that. I think eventually I'll try and make a recipe and show y'all that. I do make biscuits and gravy. It's a lovely way to make gravy. I make my eggs with cast iron in the morning. Just about anything. And it kind of varies depending on what I need, which thing I'm going to use. This is my mushroom cast iron. It's a perfect size for my smaller burner, and my husband doesn't really love mushrooms, so usually I'll cook them separately and then add it later, unless it's like a mushroom based thing like stroganoff. I'm in the process of trying to season this one a little bit more for small eggs, so that's gonna be fun once that's nice and non-stick. It's not quite there yet, but for now it's a lovely fryer. Cast iron is also arguably the best way to stir fry. The thing with stir frying is that you want a lot of hot surface area, so a traditional wok works well when you're working with like a gas stove or over a fire, but something like this on a flat top stove like I have is gonna have more heat because it can stay hotter because of how much surface area of the pan is heating up and touching the element. Highly recommend this for stir fry. I do have a wok that I use that works on it, but generally, unless I'm cooking for a very large portion, I will stick to one of these guys. Please hit me up with any of your questions that you have about cast iron in the comments. Let me know if you have cast iron and what your experience has been with it. I really appreciate you hanging out with me today. I hope to see you really soon, and I hope that you treat yourself to something delicious in the meantime.